This discovery is considered one of the most important medical breakthroughs in history, and it's the reason blood transfusions are safe today. Landsteiner eventually won the Nobel Prize for this work, and doctors today still rely on the same basic classification system he helped establish more than 100 years ago. But identifying the blood types was only the beginning. The bigger mystery was why these blood types exist at all and why different populations around the world have such dramatically different percentages of each type. This is where modern genetic research picked up where Landsteiner left off. Using tools he could never have imagined, like full genome sequencing and computer analysis of millions of data points at once, scientists eventually traced the genes responsible for blood type to a specific location on chromosome 9. The ABO gene provides instructions for making an enzyme. That enzyme is responsible for attaching sugar molecules onto the surface of red blood cells. Depending on tiny differences in the genetic code, the enzyme either attaches the sugar molecule that creates the A antigen. One of the most debated theories among scientists is why blood type A spread so successfully in certain parts of the world while remaining rare in others. The leading explanation connects blood type to the agricultural revolution, the period roughly 10,000 years ago when human society shifted from small hunting and gathering bands to larger, settled farming and herding communities. Some researchers argue that as humans began living closer together in permanent settlements, eating more grains and dairy, and coming into much closer daily contact with domesticated animals, certain blood types may have offered a survival advantage against the new infectious diseases that came bundled with that lifestyle change. Crowded villages and close contact with livestock created entirely new opportunities for pathogens to jump between animals and humans, and to spread rapidly from person to person in ways that simply didn't happen when small hunter-gatherer groups moved constantly across open land. Populations with type A blood may have had slightly better resistance to some of these new infections, allowing the trait to spread more successfully as farming communities grew, multiplied, and expanded across regions like Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. This theory is still debated, and scientists are careful to point out that blood type alone doesn't determine survival, since dozens of other genetic and environmental factors were also shifting during the same period of human history. But genetic data does show a clear and consistent pattern. Type A blood is unusually common in parts of Europe, Japan, and certain regions of the Middle East, sometimes making up close to half of the population in those areas, while it is far less common in parts of Central and South America, where type O dominates among many indigenous populations, sometimes making up more than 90% of certain communities. This tells us that blood type distribution isn't random at all. It's the product of thousands of years of migration, disease exposure, isolation, and reproduction patterns that were unique to each region of the world. There's also an important detail that most people never hear about. Type A, blood actually isn't just one single thing. Geneticists have identified multiple subtypes within type A, most commonly labeled A1 and A2, based on slightly different versions of the same chromosome 9 gene. A1 is far more common, making up the vast majority of types. In individuals, while A2 is rarer and produces a slightly weaker version of the A antigen on the surface of red blood cells. This might sound like a minor technical detail, but it actually matters in real medical situations because in rare cases, A2 blood can behave differently during transfusion matching and organ transplant compatibility testing compared to standard A1 blood. It's one more example of how something that seems as simple as a single letter on a medical form actually hides a surprising amount of genetic complexity underneath. Now, here's where the research gets genuinely important for people living today. Scientists have spent the last several decades studying whether blood type affects a person's risk for certain diseases, and the data on type A blood, specifically, has produced some consistent findings across many independent studies conducted in different countries. Large studies involving hundreds of thousands of participants have found that people with type A blood tend to have a slightly higher risk of certain cardiovascular problems compared to people with type O blood. Researchers believe this may be connected to how blood type affects a protein involved in blood clotting called von Willebrand factor. People with type A blood tend to have measurably higher levels of this clotting protein circulating in their blood, which can make their blood slightly more prone to forming clots. This might explain why some large-scale studies have found a modestly higher rate of blood clots in the legs and lungs, and a modestly higher risk of certain types of heart disease and stroke among people with type A blood compared to type O. To be clear, this doesn't mean everyone with type A blood is destined to develop heart problems, and it doesn't mean everyone with type O blood is automatically safe. It means researchers have found a statistical pattern across huge populations, a slightly elevated risk on average, not a guaranteed outcome for any individual person. Genetics is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle that includes diet, exercise, smoking, stress levels, sleep quality, and countless other factors that matter far more for most people than blood type alone. Another area where blood type research produced striking results involves the stomach. Multiple studies conducted across different populations have found a consistent connection between type A blood and a higher risk of stomach cancer. Researchers believe this may be linked to how the immune systems of people with type A blood interact with a common stomach bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, the same bacteria responsible for many stomach ulcers around the world. Some scientists believe that in people with type A blood, this bacteria may trigger a stronger and more prolonged inflammatory response in the stomach lining, which over many years of exposure could contribute to a higher long-term cancer risk. Again, this is a statistical association observed across large populations studied over long periods of time, not a personal diagnosis or prediction for any single individual. Researchers have also looked into other conditions with more mixed and still developing results. Some studies have suggested a possible link between blood type and the risk of developing certain digestive disorders, while other research has explored whether blood type plays any role in fertility and pregnancy complications. A number of studies have also examined whether blood type influences cognitive decline later in life, with a few early results hinting that type A blood might be associated with a slightly different pattern of memory-related proteins in the brain compared to type O blood. These findings are still preliminary, and scientists stress that far more research is needed before any solid conclusions can be drawn. Blood type research is a moving target, with new studies being published every year that either strengthen or weaken previous findings. Perhaps the most talked about blood type research in recent memory came out during the global health crisis caused by a certain respiratory virus a few years ago. Early on, researchers scrambling to understand why some people became extremely sick while others barely noticed symptoms began looking at every possible genetic factor, including blood type. Several early studies from different countries, including some of the first major genetic analyses published on the topic, reported that people with type A blood appeared to have a higher likelihood of severe illness and respiratory complications compared to people with type O blood, who seemed to have a slightly lower risk in some of these early data sets. For more than a century, doctors and scientists have been quietly building one of the biggest medical databases on the planet. Blood samples from hospitals, soldiers, newborn babies, elderly patients, and people on every continent on Earth. Millions and millions of blood samples, each one carrying a hidden code written inside red blood cells. Recently, researchers pulled all of that data together and ran massive genetic analyses to answer a question that has confused scientists for generations. What does your blood type actually say about you, your ancestors, and your health? And when they focused specifically on type A positive blood, the results were more surprising than anyone expected. Some of the researchers working on these projects said the patterns they found didn't just answer old questions, they raised brand new ones. Connections between ancient farmers, deadly diseases, modern illnesses, and even your risk of getting seriously sick from certain viruses. Now, let's get into what the data on type A positive blood actually revealed. To understand why this discovery matters, you first need to understand what blood type even is. Every person on Earth has red blood cells, and on the surface of those cells are tiny markers called antigens. These markers are like flags planted on the outside of your cells, and your immune system uses them to tell the difference between what belongs in your body and what doesn't. The two most important antigens for blood typing are called A and B. If your red blood cells only have A antigens, you are type A. If they only have B antigens, you are type B. If you have both, you are type AB. And if you have neither, you are type O. On top of that system, there's a second marker called the Rh factor, sometimes also called the D antigen. If your blood cells carry this marker, you are Rh positive. If they don't carry it, you're Rh negative. So when someone is type A positive, it means their red blood cells display the A antigen and also carry the Rh factor. This combination is one of the most common blood types in the world, but until recently, nobody fully understood where it came from, why it exists, or what it might be quietly doing inside the human body. The story starts more than 100 years ago in the early 1900s, when a scientist named Karl Landsteiner made a discovery that would eventually save millions of lives. Before his work, doctors had no idea why some blood transfusions worked perfectly fine, while others caused patients to become violently ill or even die. Surgeons at the time would sometimes transfuse blood directly from a healthy donor into a sick patient, hoping for the best, with no understanding of why the outcome was so unpredictable. Landsteiner realized that human blood wasn't all the same. He took blood samples from his colleagues, mixed them together in different combinations, and noticed that mixing certain samples caused the red blood cells to clump together, while other combinations mixed smoothly without any reaction at all. That clumping reaction was the immune system attacking blood it didn't recognize as its own. Through this careful, methodical work, he identified the A, B, and O blood groups. Years later, other researchers, building on his discovery, identified the Rh factor using research involving rhesus monkeys, which is where the name Rh comes from. Slightly different sugar molecule that creates the B antigen, or in the case of type O, the enzyme doesn't function properly because of a small genetic deletion. As a result, no additional A or B antigen is attached to the cell surface. Genetic researchers eventually confirmed something remarkable. Type O appears to be the oldest and most widespread ABO blood group form, while type A and type B arose through genetic changes that altered how the chromosome 9 enzyme functions. In other words, every person walking around today with type A blood is carrying the result of genetic changes that happened deep in human history. These changes were passed down through countless generations and eventually spread through entire populations across multiple continents. Researchers estimate that some versions of the A allele are ancient, and evidence from other primates suggests that A and B blood group variations have deep evolutionary roots that predate modern humans. Some great apes also carry versions of the A and B blood group genes, suggesting that these variations may trace back to distant common ancestors. This means type A blood isn't some modern development. It's an ancient trait that has been passed down through an almost unimaginable number of generations, surviving migrations, ice ages, famines, plagues, and the rise and fall of entire civilizations along the way. This finding made headlines around the world, and for a while it seemed like blood type might be one of the biggest predictors of how sick a person could become. News outlets ran story after story asking whether your blood type could determine whether you lived or died. But as more research came in from larger and more diverse populations across different countries, the picture became far more complicated. Some follow-up studies found the same pattern, others found a much weaker connection. Some large-scale studies found no meaningful difference at all. Once researchers properly accounted for other factors like age, underlying health conditions, weight, and geographic location, the scientific consensus became far more cautious than those early headlines suggested. There may be a small biological connection between blood type and immune response to certain viruses, but it is nowhere near as powerful a predictor as factors like age or existing health conditions. Blood type is at most one small piece of a much larger picture, not the dramatic prediction tool it was made out to be in the early days of the pandemic. So why would blood type affect immune response at all? Researchers have a few theories. The antigens that determine your blood type aren't just found on red blood cells. Similar sugar structures are also found on the surface of cells, lining your respiratory tract, your digestive system, and other tissues throughout your body. Some scientists believe these sugar structures might influence how easily certain viruses and bacteria can attach to and invade human cells in the first place. If a particular pathogen has evolved to latch onto cell surfaces more easily when a certain sugar pattern is present, then people with that blood type might have a slightly easier time getting infected, or a slightly harder time fighting off the infection once it takes hold in the body. Giving someone incompatible blood during a transfusion can trigger a severe, potentially fatal immune reaction within minutes, which is exactly the danger that Karl Landsteiner's work helped uncover more than a century ago. This is also why blood donation matters so much, and why hospitals go through careful, multi-step verification processes to match donors to recipients by blood type before every transfusion. On the donor side, people with type A positive blood can donate red blood cells to other type A positive recipients and to type AB positive recipients, making them valuable contributors to blood banks. Since type A is one of the commonly needed blood groups in hospitals dealing with surgeries, accidents, and ongoing treatments such as chemotherapy, donations from eligible type A donors can be important. For women who are type A positive and become pregnant, being Rh positive generally means they don't face the specific Rh incompatibility problem associated with an Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive fetus. Negative mothers carrying an Rh positive baby sometimes require special medical monitoring and a specific treatment called Rh immunoglobulin to prevent dangerous immune complications between the mother's blood and the baby's blood during pregnancy and delivery. Because type A positive already includes the Rh positive marker, this particular complication is generally not a concern in the same way. Stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, what the genetic data on type A positive blood really tells us is a story about deep human history written directly into our cells. It tells us about ancient genetic changes that occurred tens of thousands of years ago and possibly much earlier, and then spread through entire populations as farming, migration, and disease shaped which genetic traits survived, multiplied, and were passed down successfully from one generation to the next. It tells us about measurable, real, but modest connections to certain health risks that scientists are still working to fully understand through ongoing large-scale research. And it tells us about how easily solid science can get mixed up and tangled together with pop culture myths that sound convincing and specific, but simply don't hold up under real scientific testing. Your blood type is not your destiny. It doesn't determine your personality. It doesn't guarantee you'll develop any particular disease. And it isn't a lifestyle or diet plan you need to strictly follow based on internet claims. What it does represent is a small but genuinely fascinating piece of your biological history, a genetic signature connecting you to ancient ancestors, historical patterns of migration and disease across the planet, and modern medical science that continues to study exactly what these tiny sugar antigens on your red blood cells actually mean for human health today. Scientists continue to study blood type today, not because they believe it defines who you are as a person, but because understanding it better could eventually improve how doctors predict disease risk, how hospitals manage transfusions and organ transplants more safely, and how researchers understand the human immune system as a whole. Some labs are even exploring whether blood type could one day help guide more personalized medical treatments, tailored not just to your general health, but to the specific genetic markers present in your cells. The next time someone tells you they know your personality just because you're type A positive, you'll know the real science tells a very different and honestly much more interesting story. A story about survival, evolution, ancient genetic changes, farming villages, ancient plagues, and a genetic code that connects every one of us back through thousands upon thousands of generations of human history, all the way to ancestral populations and the blood group variations that eventually branched out into the diversity we see across the human family today. There's one more layer to this story that rarely gets talked about, and it involves how blood type is actually inherited from parents to children. Blood type genetics follow a pattern called codominant inheritance for the A and B alleles, combined with a separate dominant and recessive pattern for the O allele. This means every person inherits one ABO allele from their mother and one from their father. If you inherit an A allele from one parent and an O allele from the other, you become type A because the A allele is expressed over the O allele. However, you're still carrying that O allele in your genetic code, even though it doesn't show up in your blood type. This is exactly why two parents who are both type A can sometimes have a child who is type O, something that used to confuse families for generations before genetics fully explained it. Each of those type A parents was quietly carrying an O allele inherited from their own parents. When both hidden copies happened to combine in their child, the child ended up type O, even though neither parent was visibly type O. This inheritance pattern is also why blood type was used for decades, as an early rough form of paternity testing long before modern DNA testing existed. Doctors and courts could sometimes rule out a potential father if a child's blood type was genetically impossible, given the blood types of the mother and the man in question. It wasn't perfect, and it could never confirm paternity with certainty, but it could disprove it in certain clear-cut cases, making blood type one of the earliest practical applications of genetics in legal and family situations, decades before anyone could sequence a full strand of DNA. Globally, when researchers map out blood type distribution using all of this combined data, type A positive is among the most common blood types in many countries outside Latin America. In the United States, roughly a third of the population carries type A positive blood, making it one of the two most common blood types you'll find in a random group of people. In parts of Scandinavia and Central Europe, that percentage can be noticeably higher. Meanwhile, in much of Latin America, type O positive overwhelmingly dominates the population, sometimes accounting for the vast majority of people in a given country. This uneven global map isn't a coincidence or a random accident of nature. It's a living record of tens of thousands of years of human migration, isolation, disease pressure, and population growth, all preserved quietly inside blood banks and medical records around the world, waiting for scientists to piece the story back together one data set at a time. Researchers studying twins have added another fascinating layer to this picture. Because identical twins share essentially the same genetic code, they always share the same ABO and Rh blood type, which makes them incredibly valuable for scientists trying to separate genetic influences from environmental ones. Studies comparing identical twins to fraternal twins, who share roughly the same amount of genetic material as any regular siblings, have helped researchers confirm just how strongly blood type is controlled by genetics alone, with almost no environmental influence on the ABO type itself, unlike traits such as height or weight, which can be shaped significantly by diet, exercise, and general life circumstances over time. What that blood type ultimately means for your long-term health and your future is still being actively written by ongoing research all around the world. And based on everything scientists have uncovered so far, there's clearly a lot more waiting to be discovered in the years ahead.